The Queen died as the nation mourned, but behind palace walls. Her passing left more than grief. It ignited a royal earthquake. A sealed envelope, delivered by hand to King Charles, contained one line that shattered his world. For Anne alone, what was meant to be a quiet passing of wealth became a thunderclap of secrets, favoritism, and royal betrayal that would ripple through every bloodline. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It was supposed to be ceremonial, a quiet, dignified passing of power and property, carefully orchestrated like everything else in the monarchy. But this time, the script was torn apart. When King Charles received the envelope from his mother's most trusted solicitor, a man who had served in silence for over 3 decades, he thought nothing of it. Routine, perhaps. Another formality in the long list of procedures surrounding the Queen's death. But when he opened it and saw the handwritten message bearing just 4 words, it all goes to Anne, everything around him blurred. No explanation, no justification. Just a quiet betrayal wrapped in the Queen's cursive. Charles didn't speak for hours. Those who were present described a stillness that bordered on shock, as though he'd witnessed the ghost of his mother rejecting him from beyond the grave. The letter had not been filed with the official will. No palace advisor, no legal counsel had seen it. It had been hidden, locked away, known only to the Queen and her solicitor. It wasn't just a letter, it was a detonator. Behind it was a legal transfer document, valid, binding, and absolute, redirecting the Queen's personal, private fortune, believed to be worth hundreds of millions in off-record assets, lands, investment, and legacy heirlooms directly and solely to Princess Anne, not to be split, not to be debated. No clause, no override. It was done. When the news reached the rest of the royal household, silence fell like ash. There were no outbursts, only a heavy, unnerving stillness. The kind that precedes a storm. Rumors moved faster than any official statement ever could. That the Queen favored Anne, that she had long lost faith in Charles, that this wasn't an act of generosity, but of calculated judgment. For a monarchy built on tradition, it was a violent break in the bloodline logic. And for a man who had waited longer than any heir in British history to ascend the throne, it was nothing short of devastating. What haunted Charles most was the Queen's final meeting with Anne, just 5 days before her death. A private gathering, with no aides, no transcripts, no record. No one knew what was said, but those close to the family said Anne emerged from the room pale and quiet but resolved, like someone who had just been handed the weight of something ancient and sacred. Charles, excluded from that moment, now understood why. This wasn't just about money. It was a message. The Queen had handed her daughter something the King himself had never fully received, her trust. Behind closed doors, Charles was inconsolable. All the speeches, the ceremonies, the processions, they became a hollow performance. For a man who realized he may wear the crown, but never earned the heart behind it. His mother had left him the monarchy, but she had left Anne everything else. But the fortune wasn't just money. It was tied to power, independence, and decades of buried emotion. And Princess Anne, she wasn't surprised. Not even slightly. Why didn't Anne flinch when the bombshell broke? Because she knew the Queen's only daughter had been quietly prepared, slowly entrusted with pieces of a legacy that bypassed her brothers. The rest of the family dismissed her loyalty as duty, but behind her stoicism was a plan decades in the making. While the royal household reeled from the unexpected bequest, Anne remained still, too still. To those watching closely, her composure wasn't shock. It was understanding. Acceptance. A calm forged through years of whispered conversations, quiet walks through private corridors, and the passing of small but significant tokens. It hadn't happened overnight. This was no last-minute decision. It was a legacy built brick by silent brick. Long before the Queen's health began to fail, Anne had been slowly, deliberately drawn into her mother's most guarded affairs. Private meetings with estate lawyers, discreet visits to unspoken properties, and long evenings spent behind closed doors, all signs of a trust being transferred, not just financially, but symbolically. The Queen wasn't grooming an heir to the throne. She was preparing a custodian for everything the throne could never claim. There were signs, ones the others chose not to see. Jewelry not formally gifted, but quietly handed down without announcement. Pieces with deep historical weight, always worn by monarchs in solitude or mourning, found their way into Anne's private collection. Documents never filed with the Crown estates were reviewed in her presence. She accompanied the Queen to Balmoral on private weekends, just the two of them. No aides, no press, no brothers. They assumed she was merely being dutiful. They never asked what they spoke about. And Anne never told. To her mother, Anne was more than a daughter. She was a mirror, a reflection of the same steel that had held the monarchy together for decades. While Charles was molded for the spotlight, Anne had grown in the shallows, reliable, unyielding, silent in the storm. The Queen reportedly described her as the only one who never tried to be more than she was. That loyalty, that refusal to chase titles or press narratives earned her something far greater than a crown, her mother's confidence. And in that confidence, the true weight of legacy. Unlike her siblings, Anne never fought for status. She declined offers that would have elevated her rank or income. Instead, she embraced the thankless role's duties. It never made headlines but bound the royal family to its public obligation. Every step she took away from the limelight drew her closer to the Queen's inner circle. She became her mother's second voice in matters never discussed publicly, quietly managing staff turnovers, handling delicate diplomatic messages, overseeing archives no one else touched. There were moments, scribbled in diaries no longer public, that revealed the Queen's intent. One chilling line read, "Anne must hold it all when I'm gone." Anne never lobbied for this. She never needed to. She simply outlasted, outloyaled, and outperformed them all in silence. So when the inheritance was revealed, she didn't flinch because she had already been carrying the burden for years. The fortune was merely a formality. The crown of trust had been placed on her head long ago, behind doors only she and her mother had walked through. As Anne stood silently amid the storm, the rest of the family scrambled for answers, and soon the questions would turn into accusations. The moment Charles shared the contents of the letter with Prince Andrew and Prince Edward, the atmosphere turned glacial. What began as confusion turned quickly into fury. Whispers of Anne's favoritism snowballed into accusations of betrayal, and suddenly a royal bloodline once bound by grief found itself fractured. Andrew's response was volcanic. Not one to conceal his emotions, he erupted into accusations before Charles could finish reading. To him, this was no act of quiet trust, it was manipulation. He believed Anne had spent years orchestrating the Queen's perception, planting seeds of doubt about the rest of them while playing the obedient daughter. Andrew's voice, reportedly raised to a roar in Balmoral's drawing room, accused Anne of seducing their mother's favor under the guise of duty. She positioned herself to be the only one left standing, he spat, as decades of buried resentment finally surfaced. To Andrew, who had once enjoyed his mother's indulgence, this was a final and public erasure. Edward, in contrast, said little, but his silence was more devastating than rage. He had always been the most understated of the siblings, content to work quietly, to serve without drama. But this revelation cut deeper than any scandal ever had. Overlooked, ignored, bypassed. For a man who had sacrificed a higher title and more visible role to serve the crown humbly, this felt like betrayal wearing the face of family. In private, he later admitted that the Queen's decision left him questioning whether loyalty had ever truly mattered, or if it was just something they told the ones who weren't chosen. The confrontation in Balmoral was tense, bitter, and unsparing. Charles, reeling for his own devastation, stood between two brothers demanding blood and a sister who refused to entertain their accusations. When pressed to explain, Anne didn't offer justification. She didn't plead. She didn't defend. Her words, cool and controlled, sliced deeper than any rebuttal. "You were all looking up," she said, eyes steady. "I was the only one who looked after her." With that, the room fell into a silence thicker than rage, a silence that declared the conversation was over, whether they accepted it or not. Even when the Queen's lawyers were summoned to clarify the matter, the truth only widened the emotional chasm. The documents were signed, sealed, and above legal challenge. The transfer of the private fortune had been executed under full authority, with no sign of coercion. Every action bore the Queen's conscious approval. There was no loophole to unravel, no secret scheme to expose. It was the Queen's will, clear, final, and irreversible. But legal clarity did not soothe emotional wounds. If anything, it fanned the embers of a new, unspoken war. Lines were drawn in silence. Conversations became colder. Private meetings occurred behind closed doors. Loyalty fractured, alliances shifted, and for the first time in decades, the royal siblings began to resemble rival heirs rather than kin. A family known for unity in the public eye was slowly, but surely, splintering at its core. But behind the drama among siblings, a deeper question began to haunt King Charles. Had his mother ever truly trusted him with the legacy? He waited his entire life to become king, yet in the one moment that should have solidified his authority, his mother's final decision tore it away. What does it mean to wear the crown when your own mother left her true trust to someone else? Charles spiraled privately, unsure whether he inherited a throne or a rejection. In the public eye, Charles wore the crown with grace, but behind palace doors, he battled a growing storm within. Every newspaper headline, every royal commentator whispering about the Queen's final act, chipped away at his already fragile sense of certainty. It wasn't just about Anne receiving the fortune, it was about what it symbolized. To the public, it seemed like a silent indictment, a cold rebuke from a monarch known for restraint. For Charles, it felt like confirmation of his greatest fear, that he had never truly been seen, not as a man, not a son, and certainly not as a leader. As he retreated into his thoughts, memories clawed their way to the surface. Moments that once seemed inconsequential now carried sharp edges. The Queen declining to attend his early policy briefing. Her rare, brief compliments always filtered through duty, never affection. The way she lit up in Anne's presence conversations that seemed effortless between mother and daughter, while his own encounters with her felt like interviews. Staff who had worked closely with the Queen for decades quietly confirmed what Charles had only dared to think in solitude. He was respected, obeyed, but never quite embraced. One former aide revealed that Charles often stood by the doors of meetings, waiting to be asked in. Even when the meeting was about him, at national events, the Queen's behavior once written off as protocol now read differently. The subtle positioning, the glances that skipped over him, the warmth saved for Anne when no cameras were watching. It wasn't that the Queen dismissed him as a monarch. It was that as a son he had never broken past her guard. And now, in death, she had confirmed what life only hinted at. One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, Charles broke down. Camilla found him seated alone, holding the letter one more time as if it might change. "I was never the one," he muttered, a statement not of bitterness, but of exhausted realization. Camilla listened in silence, but her silence wasn't passive. While Charles crumbled under the weight of disappointment, she recognized a moment of vulnerability that could either destroy the monarchy or redefine it. Charles began revisiting every moment with Anne, every shared laugh between mother and daughter. Every time Anne stepped forward while he held back, he asked himself questions he'd long buried. Had the Queen always known Anne would be the more dependable one? Had she shaped him into a monarch, while secretly shaping Anne into her shadow heir? The legacy he thought he inherited now felt borrowed, conditional, and as he stood in front of the mirror wearing the crown, he wondered if the world saw a king or a placeholder. Yet while Charles wavered in grief and disbelief, Camilla saw an opportunity to reclaim control and restore the king's dignity through any means necessary. Queen consort Camilla wasn't going to stand idle while Anne walked away with the Queen's private empire. To her, this wasn't just about inheritance, it was about influence. Camilla began her own quiet campaign, meeting with loyal aides, tracking Anne's every move, and crafting a narrative to win back the palace. She understood the game better than most. Power wasn't always declared, it was constructed behind the scenes, one whisper at a time. In the days following the inheritance bombshell, Camilla convened private meetings with Charles's most trusted PR strategists. The goal was singular: reshape the story before it reshaped the monarchy. If the public began to view Anne as the Queen's true successor, not in title, but in spirit, then Charles's crown would become ceremonial. Camilla wouldn't allow that. She pushed for controlled leaks, subtle shifts in language, and carefully planted headlines that framed Anne's inheritance as unexpected, potentially problematic, or strategically questionable. The plan was not to attack Anne outright. It was to erode the foundation of reverence slowly building around her. But behind those palace walls, Camilla was doing far more than managing optics. She personally requested access to royal archives and historical asset record, determined to uncover any gaps in the Queen's private estate transfer. Was anything missed? Any discrepancy? Any oversight that could be spun into a controversy? She combed through decades of documents, legal trails, and backseat Hunnell correspondence. At one point, she even authorized a quiet outreach to the royal archivist asking whether the Queen had ever promised any assets to Charles or the crown that were now mysteriously under Anne's name. The archivist refused to comment. Camilla then turned her focus inward toward the fractured royal family. She saw Edward's disappointment as an opening and invited him to a discreet luncheon at Clarence House. Her offer was laced with subtle incentives: greater visibility in the king's upcoming Commonwealth engagements, increased funding for his charitable foundation, and a quiet promise of greater influence over future royal patronages. To Zara, she extended an informal invitation to represent the crown at a high-profile international event, something typically reserved for senior royals. It wasn't bribery, it was leverage. Simultaneously, Camilla commissioned a private investigator, one unaffiliated, with royal staff to track financial transfers made by the Queen in her final years. Offshore accounts, real estate holdings, art assets, all were mapped. She believed that if Anne held more than the public knew, there might be room to question whether the Queen had acted in the best interest of the monarchy, or had simply favored her daughter over the crown. Camilla wasn't just fighting for Charles's image, she was fighting for her own relevance. One royal aide, speaking off the record, revealed Camilla's greatest fear. She believed Anne would overshadow the throne, if left unchallenged. But for all her calculations, Camilla faced an infuriating obstacle: Anne's silence. The Princess Royal gave no interviews, responded to no headlines, and engaged in no rebuttals. She moved with the same stoic composure she always had, making it impossible to provoke her into misstep. The more Camilla maneuvered, the more unshakable Anne appeared. It became a war of movement versus stillness, and just when Camilla thought she was gaining ground, just when the public began asking questions, a single, explosive document would emerge that rewrote the entire narrative and stripped her strategy bare. But as Camilla spun her web, Anne remained untouched, unfazed, and one shocking piece of evidence was about to surface that would destroy any counter-narrative locked away in. The Queen's most guarded legal file was a codicil, an amendment to her private will that none of her children knew existed. It was discovered only when a second solicitor came forward, revealing that the Queen's fortune was just one part of the legacy, the rest. Something Anne had been safeguarding all along. What emerged from that hidden legal file was more than a document, it was a revelation that reframed everything. The codicil, signed in absolute secrecy and sealed in a private trust chamber, outlined the transfer of assets so historically profound they sent tremors through the monarchy's inner sanctum. We're not talking about bank accounts or land deeds. These were the Queen's most private holdings, ancestral letters, royal heirlooms never catalogued publicly, foreign properties acquired quietly over decades, and sensitive documents that, if exposed, could shift the perception of the monarchy itself. And standing at the center of it all was Princess Anne. The codicil named her as steward of the private legacy, a title never before seen in royal record, one that carried full discretion to preserve, reveal, or destroy any element as she deemed fit. This was the Queen's final act, not a gift, but a responsibility. Included with the codicil were handwritten letters, pages thick with emotion, explaining her reasoning. One passage read, "This burden cannot be carried by the throne. It must be held by the one who never sought it." And in another, "Charles is to reign, Anne is to remember." These letters were unflinchingly honest. In them, the Queen reflected on her fears about public image, about legacy, about how history would interpret not just her reign, but her family. But what struck hardest was her private acknowledgement of Charles's lifelong internal struggles. She wrote of his public obligations weighing heavily, of his need for validation often clouding judgment. She expressed a quiet heartbreak, confessing she had at times failed to bridge the emotional gap between them. But the conclusion was brutal. She believed Charles would protect the crown, but only Anne would protect the truth. When the codicil was finally shown to Charles, his face reportedly went pale, not because of what was given to Anne, but because of what was revealed about him. His mother's doubts, scrawled in her own hand, stripped away any illusion that this was a financial oversight or a misjudgment. This was deliberate. She had divided her legacy in two, one half to rule, one half to remember, and in doing so, she exposed the fault lines of her family. Legal advisors confirmed there would be no contesting the codicil. The signatures, witnesses, and seals were all in order. It had been executed flawlessly, locked away in a different vault than the main will, and handed over with exacting precision at the designated term. This wasn't hidden. It was protected by design. Anne's reaction was quiet, but those close to her described it not as triumph, but sorrow. A heavy silence followed her through the halls as she carried boxes of sealed letters, artifacts, and files to her private quarters. There was no celebration, because this wasn't wealth, it was weight. The kind of weight only her mother believed she could bear. Anne had never asked for it, but she had accepted it, because someone had to, as the codicil spread through palace corridors. Like wildfire, public curiosity turned to public pressure. The media smelled blood. Once the press got wind of the Queen's private fortune bypassing the king, headlines turned into daggers. King snubbed by mother, Princess Anne, the real heir. The monarchy was under siege not from outside forces, but from within. Every camera, every microphone, now demanded answers. It began as a whisper, then escalated into a roar. What was once confined to palace corridors exploded across the front pages of tabloids and broadsheets alike. The narrative was no longer in royal control. Charles was painted as the forgotten son, a monarch crowned by duty, not by choice. Meanwhile, Anne, who had never asked for a throne, was now seen as the Queen's true successor, not in title but in trust. Every news cycle added fuel to the fire. Anonymous palace insiders fed the frenzy with leaks that stunned even the seasoned royal press corps. Claims surfaced that the Queen had long harbored private doubts about Charles's leadership, citing conversations where she allegedly referred to him as too fragile to carry the family's deepest burdens. One report quoted a former aide saying, "The Queen admired Charles, but she depended on Anne." Public opinion began to tilt. Online petitions gathered momentum, calling for Anne to be given a more active constitutional role. Commentators debated openly whether she, not Charles, represented the monarchy's moral center. Hashtags flooded social media, elevating Anne as a symbol of strength, loyalty, and unshakable discretion, everything the public now questioned in their new king. This wasn't about lineage anymore. This was about trust. The people didn't just want a monarch who ruled. They wanted one who had been chosen in silence. And then came the backlash against Camilla. A series of private messages were leaked, messages where she allegedly referred to Anne as a relic and accused her of turning grief into a power grab. The fallout was swift. The Queen Consort's reputation, already fragile, suffered a brutal hit. Accusations of sabotage, manipulation, and internal plotting dominated headlines. Public trust in Camilla plummeted as Anne's remained bulletproof. And as the storm raged, Buckingham Palace released a carefully worded, ambiguous statement, neither confirming nor denying the contents of the Queen's private codicil. The words were deliberate. Matters of personal inheritance remain private and will not be subject to public commentary. But that silence only fueled speculation. Approval ratings began to reflect the chaos. Charles's popularity, which had risen in the early days of his reign, took a sharp downturn. Royal commentators noted the timing. He was losing ground, not because of scandal, but because of omission. He had not addressed the Queen's final act. He had not acknowledged Anne, and the public noticed. But while the world debated what just happened, Anne herself was preparing to take a step no one anticipated. What that would redefine her role in royal history. She had the power to rewrite royal history, but Anne made a choice that stunned the nation. Rather than elevate herself, she enacted a quiet plan that would honor her mother, protect her legacy, and secure the future of the monarchy without igniting a civil war among royals. But her final move left Charles even more broken, behind closed doors, away from the media firestorm. And the court of public opinion, Anne requested a private audience with her brother. There were no advisors, no aides, just the two of them, siblings, not sovereigns. What unfolded in that room wasn't an apology, nor was it a justification. It was a moment of clarity. Anne laid everything bare, the Queen's intentions, the weight of the codicil, the burden she never asked to carry. She didn't gloat, she didn't waver, she simply told the truth. And for the first time in months, Charles listened without resistance. Still reeling from the emotional blow of his mother's silent judgment, he searched Anne's eyes not for answers but for relief. And what she offered him was something far more valuable than a concession. It was peace. Anne's next move was unexpected. Rather than protect the fortune for herself or wield it as quiet leverage, she announced the formation of a private foundation, one solely dedicated to the values and causes their mother had held closest: preservation of historical estates, quiet patronage of wartime veterans, support for equine therapy, youth empowerment, and discreet charities the Queen had funded private. For decades, the money, Anne declared, would serve not her but the memory of their mother. It would be managed independently, with her as its steward, not its owner. She even went further. Anne declined any personal profit from the foundation, placing her portion of the Queen's holdings under a legal trust that prevented her from ever claiming it as private wealth. This wasn't just generosity, it was strategy. She stripped the scandal of its teeth. The press, once hungry for a royal rivalry, suddenly had nothing to feed on. The public saw a woman who had been handed power and chose responsibility instead. A statement soon followed, delivered not at a press conference, not on live television, but through a quietly released letter. It read simply, "Loyalty isn't loud. It's lived." And with that, Princess Anne redefined her place in royal history. She became not a rival to the king, but the conscience of the crown. The media, long divided, began to speak with rare unity. Commentators called it the most selfless act the monarchy had witnessed in decades. The tide of public opinion shifted once more, but this time not in anger or outrage. It turned toward admiration. Quiet, enduring, and unshakable, Charles, though moved by Anne's gesture, could not escape the truth. His mother's trust had passed through him, not because he was unworthy of it, but because he had never understood what it truly required. And while Anne had offered reconciliation, his reflection in the legacy she left behind would forever remain fractured. But as the dust settled, and the foundation was launched in the Queen's name, one final revelation from Windsor's vault would threaten to reopen every wound, locked away for decades. A bundle of handwritten letters from the Queen was uncovered in a Windsor vault, each letter addressed to her children, each brutally honest. But the letter to Charles, it was the shortest. What it said and didn't say would leave the king staring out over the balcony, alone, thought, and forever changed. It was supposed to be the final administrative step. Royal archivists were instructed to catalogue the last of the Queen's estate materials before the closure of Windsor's restricted vaults. But what they uncovered wasn't listed on any official inventory. TUC. Kept away in a sealed compartment beneath a locked cabinet were 4 envelopes, each marked only by a name. Anne, Edward, Andrew, Charles, each written in the Queen's unmistakable hand. They weren't legal documents. They weren't meant for public reading. These were private, final messages, and as they were carefully delivered to the intended recipients, a new layer of the Queen's legacy came into view, one that had never been spoken aloud. Anne's letter was the longest. It praised her unyielding loyalty, her quiet strength, and her lifelong refusal to seek glory. The Queen wrote of her pride in Anne's ability to shoulder responsibility without seeking reward, calling her the steel thread holding this family together. Edward's letter was gentler, urging him to remain the keeper of discretion. Your silence, the Queen wrote, has protected this family more times than you know. Continue to be the calm we will need. Andrew's letter, however, was cryptic. Carefully worded and distant, it referenced unnamed regrets and warned that some truths must remain buried for everyone's sake. It ended not with affection but with caution, a tone that suggested unfinished business the Queen chose never to resolve. But it was Charles's letter that left everyone breathless. It contained only 5 words you will understand in time. No praise, no apology, no signature flourish. Just a haunting fragment of thought that raised more questions than it answered. Those 5 words, delivered to a man who had waited an entire lifetime for his mother's full acceptance, were both a riddle and a reckoning. To Charles, it felt like the final confirmation of a suspicion that had followed him like a shadow his entire life, that he had inherited a role but never the certainty that he was meant to bear it. Sources close to the king revealed he stood in silence for nearly an hour after reading it, eyes fixed on the gardens below his private study. There were no tears, just stillness. A man crowned by duty, haunted by ambiguity. A man who had become king, but who may never be remembered as the Queen's true successor, not in spirit, not in purpose, and not in her final words. The letters were never made public, but the impact of their contents echoed across the palace. Conversations were quiet, expressions changed, and Anne once again said nothing, because she didn't need to. The Queen's fortune was never about money. It was about trust. And in the end, she entrusted it not to the crown, but to the only one who never asked for it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.